Hello, this is Life is Lyudmila Nemyria, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And we are very happy and very proud that our guest today is Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman. He is Emeritus Professor of War Studies, King's College, London. Professor, hello, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Professor, after the 11th year of war, and after 3 years of big war, negotiations between Ukraine and Russia have started. And in that case, we have many questions about that. How do you assess this process? And with which position Ukraine and Russia entered to this negotiation? What is wrong and what is right in the action and understanding of process from the Trump's administration, and how you assess the action of Britain, France, and Germany, and maybe other European countries? Sorry for so many questions, but the process is too complicated, you know.
Well, it is a complicated process. I think what has happened is that President Trump started off with an idea which he'd campaigned on last year, which doesn't really work. And his idea essentially was that there should be a ceasefire, and he hadn't really thought much beyond that. I think it's perfectly genuine. He doesn't like the bloodshed. He wanted to see it end. And I think it was also, as President Zelensky eventually realized, worked largely in Ukraine's favor, because Ukraine could probably do with a ceasefire. But for Putin, it's a problem because a ceasefire without him having met any of his political objectives, essentially with Ukraine still independent and sovereign, would be a problem. So I think what we've seen over the last few months is essentially a process by which Trump has continued to push this idea. Putin has tried to avoid it while not wishing to be seen to be opposed to peace negotiations. And Zelensky, after a difficult starting weeks, has basically got into line and used every opportunity to say, look, I'm the one who supports the ceasefire. And the Europeans have obviously come in behind Zelensky on that position. What I think happened last week was that Putin realized that Trump was getting close to sort of his final demand, which was just have a ceasefire by the, I think eventually it was going to be by the 12th of May or something, or else there'll be sanctions. And so Putin said, came in, as he often does, with his own unilateral proposals that essentially said, we'll meet on Thursday in Istanbul. Trump believed he'd said, Putin will meet on Thursday in Istanbul, which he'd never said. So he urged Zelensky to go along as well. Zelensky said, yes, I will. But of course, Putin never intended to attend, was never going to attend. So what then happened was, when Zelensky turned up and Rubio turned up and Trump was in the vicinity, Putin was nowhere to be seen, but he sent a sort of low-scale delegation. And at this point, Trump said, oh, this isn't going to work until I speak again to Putin. And when he spoke to Putin, the process which Putin wanted and which had been set in motion on the last week in Istanbul was sort of endorsed by Putin, by Trump, again on the mistaken assumption that somehow this was going to lead to an immediate ceasefire. So I don't think Trump has understood what's going on with this process for much of the time. Putin has understood perfectly well, and I think Zelensky's understood perfectly well, but not Trump. So I think this is basically the end of Trump's initiative. He could come back, but basically he said, well, it's up to the belligerents now sort it out, and they're talking to each other. And just to sort of conclude this, the Istanbul process means to Putin the continuation of the early negotiations that ended in April 22, where he claims there was a draft agreement which only Western pressure got Ukraine to abandon. Now, this is not what happened, and the discussions then were in completely different circumstances. And then you had Busher and all the revelations about Russian atrocities and so on. But there's now a process of direct talks, and both sides are supposed to come up with a memorandum about their objectives. But we can assume that the Russian memorandum will be more or less what it was in April 22, with demands for caps on Ukrainian forces, no security guarantees, pure neutrality, maybe regime change. Except the difference now is that Russia's claiming not just Crimea and some recognition for Donetsk and Luhansk, but also now saying that Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson should be part of Russia. None of this Ukraine is going to agree to. So we have a negotiating track which may be useful to have in place, maybe more prisoner exchanges, maybe something else, but it isn't going to lead to peace until Russia has a change of heart.
Professor, let me back to some your points. You say about the continuation of Istanbul process, if we continue now in Istanbul. Do you think that Vatican is better?
I think Vatican would be very good for Ukraine, because anybody who knows Chicago, where the new Pope comes from, knows there's a very strong Ukrainian community there. And the things he said about Ukraine are far more pro-Ukrainian than his predecessor, who was, happy for Ukraine to wave a white flag. That's not what Pope Leo has said. And he understands the issues. Clearly, what he said shows he understands the issues. So though Trump has proposed it, and the Vatican seems interested, and Prime Minister Meloni would be supportive, I'd be very surprised if Putin had any interest in that. It would be sort of amusing to have the head of the Catholic Church presiding over two Orthodox countries, which is split. I mean, so you have a Ukrainian branch and a Russian branch, because the Russian branch went wholly nationalist. So it would be very interesting if the Vatican played a role, and it's played a role in past conflicts. It's not as if it couldn't play a role. I just can't believe Putin is going to be that interested.
You say that this is the end of Trump initiative. But if this is the end of Trump initiative, it shows the weakness of Trump, weakness of America for all over the world. Do you think that it's really true? And I think it could be a problem even for America as well.
Well, Trump hasn't said it's the end of his initiative, and he hasn't precluded coming back. It's just he's endorsed a process in which the United States is not directly involved. Now, it's possible that if one side or the other walked away, then the US could come back in. I think whatever was going to happen, there was a basic problem that what Trump, and for that matter, Ukraine wanted, was quite different from what Russia wanted, because Russia's objectives were set out last June and they haven't changed. They want regime change, they want disarmament, they don't want Ukraine to be an independent and sovereign state. So there was always going to be a problem of that sort. Trump hasn't announced that it's all over, that he's failed. He said he claimed to be going out on a high note. I think that the real issues are, given that it's very hard to blame Ukraine for the current state of affairs, will he maintain current sanctions will he, even if there's not a major new arms bill passing through Congress, which I doubt, partly for budgetary reasons, if nothing else, will he allow Europeans, for example, to buy the better kit, the better air defences and so on, and pass them on? At the moment, I think the indications are reasonably positive on that. I don't think it doesn't look like they're going to do what they did after the White House meeting and cut off supplies and end intelligence and so on. I don't think that. I'd be very surprised if that happened. And Congress is pushing for more economic sanctions, so that potentially could happen. So I don't think it's a calamity for Ukraine particularly, because I don't think the process was ever going anywhere. The major thing Ukraine had to avoid was getting the blame, and it looked like at one point it might. I think now that's been avoided, so that's positive. I never had great expectations for this process. I think, we need the problem, as you all well know, is keeping going until at some point Putin realizes this is all futile. But it's not, and if Trump had shrugged his shoulders and said, I give up, that would have one reaction, but he hasn't said that. So the process is fading away rather than ending abruptly.
You say about political objects, and your book, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine, was published in April 2024. It's just a brilliant book. It's a comparison of different wars. It's absolutely brilliant. But if I understand right, you wrote that politics is a key factor of military operation. You also wrote about the reasons for a long-term conflict. Taking into account everything you say in this book, what scenarios for Russia's war against Ukraine are possible? And again, do you think that a ceasefire is possible in some time?
I think a ceasefire is possible at some point. That's how it'll end. It could just peter out, in the sense that Russia does less but can defend. Ukrainian can defend, but neither are confident of offensive, so nothing much happens. That's a possibility, but a more likely is a ceasefire at some point, because only with a ceasefire can you even begin to unravel everything else that's going on. And for Russia, that would mean economic sanctions. So yes, a ceasefire is possible, but it's political. The problem for Putin is that if he hasn't achieved his political objectives, subjugation of Ukraine, then he's got a reckoning at home. He's got to explain what all this was for. Why have all these people died? Why has the economy been put through all of this? Why we isolated ourselves and got ourselves junior partner to China? All of these things have got to be explained if effectively the war ended with an independent, vibrant, looking forward Ukraine. So I think that's his problem. And I think we all wrestle with trying to work out the circumstances in which Putin would decide, or those around him or somebody else in the Russian elite, that this has got to stop. The economy is one factor. I don't think it's approaching a cliff edge, but it's certainly getting more difficult. Oil price will stay low, I expect. Growth in the economy is declining. Inflation high, and so on. So the economy is a problem. He's going to run out. They can still find people to fight, but they have to pay them a lot to do so. And that's a burden on the economy, and some estimates suggest by next year that he'd have to move to mobilization again. They're using up all their legacy equipment and so on. So at some point, if presuming, and I think this is the case, that Ukraine is able to hold its position, then it's going to be harder and harder to avoid the question of futility. I mean, I'm in the latest thing I wrote, I was sort of speculating at the end, and it's pure speculation as to whether Ukraine at some point will, having essentially been resisting a Russian offensive since late 2023, will want to start thinking about an offensive of its own again. Now we know it was difficult last time. We saw Kursk, which showed the possibilities, but again also some of the difficulties. So I wouldn't sort of Russian advocate this, but it does seem to me that one of the few things that would certainly give Moscow a jolt is realizing that they've gone about as far, not only have they gone about as far as they're going to get in terms of taking Ukrainian territory, but there's a possibility that they're going to lose some of it. And that, I think, could create pressure for a ceasefire. So it's always depended a bit on the shape of the military confrontation, and I think that will continue. They're still at the moment pressing. There hasn't been the same intensity of fighting for the last few months, but it may be that they were just gathering forces for a new offensive, and Ukraine will have to cope with that. So I'm always careful about predicting how the battle will develop, but looking back from just over a year ago, and what was thought then, Ukraine has done pretty well. I mean, last year was the year in which Russia really should have won. It had advantages in artillery. The start of the year, the Americans were holding back. Ukrainian production, European production was still building up. So I think last year was Russia's real opportunity. Maybe they've got a bit longer, but I think the sort of incompetence of their ground operation is still quite surprising. But fortunately that's the case. But they're just not very good at it, and they lose a lot of people in the process.
Last year we had a support from America, for example, and this year I worry that it will be very complicated with weapons. What do you think about that? Do you think that Europe will be ready to compensate some weapons for us? How it looks like from Britain?
I think, look, I think you've lost America. It's just there's clearly a reluctance to commit in the way that it committed before. I think there's still a lot of support for Ukraine in the US, but it's just not going to be as good as it was. I think that's true for Europe. I mean, the US is not going to be as supportive of Europe more generally as it was. Well, there's something we just have to learn to live with. I think Europe stood up, especially after the Oval Office meeting and so on. I think it's pretty clear that President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, Chancellor Merz are forming a triumvirate of strong support for Ukraine. Germany has just announced major increases to its budget. I think slowly but surely defense production has improved in Europe. And of course, defense production has improved a lot in Ukraine. You're less dependent upon others than you were. And that's helpful. So I'm not, I wouldn't be despondent about it. I think the emotional and political support is still very strong. It's always would always prefer to see more. But I think there's now a strong connection between the European leadership and your leadership, Ukraine's leadership. And I think it's pretty clear that the European leaders have come to the strategic conclusion that they really can't allow Ukraine to fail, that it's vital that Russia fails. Now, it may end up with a messy compromise of some sort, because clearly a ceasefire in which 20% of your territory is still held by Russia is not a desirable outcome, but it's not the worst outcome at the moment. And it would still represent a Russian failure, because if Russia succeeded, not only would it be terrible for Ukraine, it would create enormous security issues for Europe as well. So I think that strategic judgment has been made. And at the moment, the means are there to back that judgment. Now, if Russia got renewed strength or made some breakthroughs, then there might be more challenges in that. So again, you can't predict the future, but for the moment, I think European support is pretty steady.
Let's back to negotiations and compromises. In your book, you wrote, "Victory." Let me quote. "Victory is not just about occupied territories, but about forcing the enemy to accept your conditions. It is always a political act." Does it mean that if Ukraine is forced to make some compromises during negotiation, does it mean that Russia will win with all the consequences that follow?
I think there's a difference between winning and not losing, or not winning and losing. I think for Putin, a ceasefire on the current basis would not be a win, because Ukraine, you'd still have your own government, you'd be able to keep your own defense industry, your own armed forces, and while membership of NATO might still be problematic, you'll still be able to get some sort of partnerships, security assurances of some sort with other European countries, if not the US. So that for Putin would not be victory. I don't think he could present it as victory. And his problem also is that he has got quite a bit of Ukrainian territory. Obviously, that territory has suffered enormously by the war itself. It's been battered, it's depopulated, it's full of unexploded ordnance and so on. And it's not complete. I mean, as we know, his basic military objective for the last couple of years has basically been to push the occupied territory at least to the boundaries of Donetsk as well as Luhansk, and also to the classical boundaries of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, and he's well away from that. The Russians have made surprisingly little progress in that direction. So he's annexed territory which he doesn't completely own. None of this can be considered a victory. Now, for Ukraine, it's hard to consider it a victory either if your territory is still under occupation, and all you can do is say this is still our territory, even if you don't have to recognize it. And that's sort of what would have happened if Trump's proposals had gone through. So I think the questions for negotiation, and I'm not very optimistic, are really, are there ways by which Ukraine can have security guarantees which are acceptable to Russia? And in the previous Istanbul talks, it seemed that progress had been made on that, until Russia sort of put itself down as one of the guarantors and said all the guarantors have got to agree together if anything should be done, which is obviously pretty useless, given that Russia was the most likely aggressor next time round. So that's one set of issues. Are there ways of formulating security guarantees? Are are there ways of keeping the four oblasts, other than Crimea, inside Ukraine, without while giving some concessions to what Russia believes are the needs of Russian language speakers? It just takes us back to Minsk, essentially. I mean, all the problems with Minsk would still be there, including how you hold free and fair elections, whether you can do anything while foreign troops are in your country, and so on. So it's very difficult. There are, again, going back to the early days after the full-scale invasion, there were proposals then for or consideration then of plebiscites in the Donetsk and Luhansk. It's very difficult to see how you could make that work. Or you could have dual citizenship and so on. There's a variety of ideas that you could play with, but none of them seem very satisfactory. Then you've got all the issues of reparations, of war crimes. On the Ukrainian side, you've got the question of economic sanctions. On the Russian side, even if you had a positive feeling and a serious negotiation, there's weeks, months of negotiations there to try to sort that out. So I think the best you can hope for is Russia agreeing to some sort of ceasefire with a timetable for a political negotiation. At the moment, their position is you have to have a political negotiation. When that's all complete, you can have a ceasefire. I think probably the best you could get is the other way around. That Ukraine commits to address all these other issues, but with the confidence that the fighting has stopped. Again, I find all this very difficult. I think until there's a much more fundamental change in Moscow, it's quite hard to see the mechanisms by which this war comes to an end. The change could happen quite abruptly because we don't have good knowledge of discussions in the Kremlin, and there could be surprises and shocks that like the Prigozhin mutiny. I mean, you could see that there was a problem there, but nobody thought it would end like that. So again, you can't predict, and there are many twists and turns, but we have reached a point where both sides have got a pretty good idea what they can and can't do militarily, and it's not easy to see where either side can get a dramatic breakthrough from at the moment.
Professor, do you think that Russia is predictable or unpredictable country? I mean, maybe Kremlin, or better to say that Kremlin. Is it predictable or unpredictable?
Well, I didn't predict that they would invade Ukraine the way they did, and even it was hard because it seemed such a stupid thing to do, and the hardest thing to predict is another stupidity. If everybody's acting rationally, then it becomes easier. I think you can follow what Russia does. Putin talks a lot. You can read what he says. You can see his thought process. You don't know how much he knows, how much he's being told by his generals, but even he must have worked out that he was supposed to be in a better position by now with what they've taken on the ground. So I don't think any country is wholly predictable, but I think it is possible to see the parameters within which they're operating and the assumptions on which their actions are based. And I haven't found it that. I found a lot of 2022 difficult to predict, but since then it's become much easier, and because Putin is set, and he's, as I said before, his problem is how does he get out of this without admitting that he's lost? That's his problem when he can't win. I mean, even Vice President Vance, said the other day that Putin doesn't know how to get out of this. I think that's right, except I think Putin would see it more as how do I win? I think Putin still wants to win, and he was hoping, I think, to achieve through negotiations what he hasn't achieved through his military operations. And so I don't think the failure of the Trump process is particularly great for Putin. I think, I think Putin saw Trump as his best hope for an administration that could put real pressure on Ukraine and somehow deliver what he wanted. He just pushed too much. Again, to quote Vance, he asked too much. And that was his problem. And he hasn't yet worked what his concessions can be. He's yet to offer through all of these months of back and forth any single concession, because the concessions are all damaging to him. I mean, Ukraine, it's much more straightforward. You've lost territory, you'd like it back, but other than that, you want to carry on as you are. For Putin, he wants to change the character of Ukraine, and Ukraine is strong enough to deny him that.
Let's speak a little bit about strategic plan of Putin. What I mean, do you think that Putin is preparing for invasion to some European countries? Because many European leaders say about that. This first question. And second question, do you think that Putin tried to create something like coalition with North Korea and with Iran or somebody else? Do you think that China is the ally of Putin? Because I think it is very important question.
It is. So the first bit is, I mean, I know people worry about what Russia may try against European countries. I think it's inconceivable at the moment, when he hasn't beaten Ukraine, that he would think about taking on NATO, which is what an attack on other European countries would mean, when he would face very competent forces with air power and so on. Now, clearly it's difficult to defend the Baltic states. They're quite small. There's not a lot of troops in them and so on. But the risks, I think, would be enormous. I think that situation would change if he was successful in Ukraine. I mean, and I think you could imagine scenarios. I mean, I thought these were possible in 22, in which Russia would put pressure on neighboring countries not to support Ukraine, not to let arms get into Ukraine over their borders and so on. So you could imagine the scenarios, short of just wanting to seize these countries as well. But at the moment, that isn't, I have to say, my major concern. I think Europe needs to do an awful lot to compensate for the Americans probably moving a lot of their troops out of Europe, and building up a much more capable deterrence of their own. So I don't think one should be complacent about it, but it's not my major worry at the moment. From Putin's point of view, I think it was embarrassing to go to North Korea and Iran, but he did it. North Korea is extracting support, revenue, technology from Russia in return. Iran obviously provides the Shaheeds and missile technology, and it's been unfortunately helpful to Putin. Iran, I think, is potentially a weak link in all of this because it's a vulnerable regime, and if the regime collapsed, that would be a problem for Trump. China, I think, is much more complicated. The Chinese have not given anything like what the North Koreans gave. They don't see them. They're absolutely clear that they're not allies of Russia. They've given a lot of economic support, and they've given some material support, probably in spare parts, microchips or whatever. But they haven't invested greatly in Russia. I don't think President Xi wants Putin to fail. I think he would find that embarrassing. So he'll give support, but he hasn't supported the basic political objectives. Unlike the North Koreans, who came out supporting Putin's political objectives, Xi hasn't done that. And of course, he's got relations with Ukraine. I mean, it's not as if the Chinese still talk to Ukraine. So I think it's complex. And I don't think that leads to the belief that it's easy for us to drive a wedge between Russia and China. I think the relationship will carry on as it is, but I don't think one should overstate it. And of course, for the Russians, it's embarrassing in the sense that it used to be the case that the Soviet Union was the senior partner and China very much the junior. I think Russia finding itself in the position of junior partner isn't good. And of course, they've lost all their other options. They've cut themselves off from the rest of Europe. So I think the sort of undercurrents of unhappiness in Moscow about the partnership with China, but for the moment, it probably suits both countries to carry on as it is.
Professor, separating Russia from China has been the important part of American foreign policy for a decade. Can we say that this policy has failed completely?
Well, it could happen, but I think it was always unrealistic. In the 1970s, China and the Soviet Union were already at each other. I mean, this big split had occurred in the 1960s, and Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, was able to take advantage of that and develop good relations with Moscow and good relations with Beijing, and it was quite cleverly done. But we're in a very different situation. Russia and I mean, whatever happens, I don't think Russia and China want to go back to the situation of the late 60s when they almost went to war with each other. There is a contested border and so on, but I think for the moment, they both have their grievances with the United States, and they're not interested in splitting away from the other. I just think the relationship is unbalanced between Russia and China doesn't have to give a lot to keep it going. I think Russia is very much the junior in the relationship, but I think the idea of a wedge of, I think some American strategists thinking that somehow you can give Russia its sphere of influence in Europe in return for the United States having a sphere of influence in the Pacific just doesn't recognize geopolitical realities.
And last question, if it is possible, in your in one of your last interview, you say about exposing deep fracture in the global balance of power. How will the war in Ukraine affect this balance of power, and how will this formation of new balance of power affect the end of the war in Ukraine?
China at the moment is doing quite well out of Trump. I mean, a lot of countries that would have looked to the United States are now irritated with the United States because of tariffs and so on. In the Middle East, he's doing well. I mean, the Gulf states like him. In Europe, not so good. Africa, he's more or less abandoned. India's cross because of the way that the its conflict with Pakistan was handled, and so on. So Trump has lost ground, and China has gained ground. China's got big internal problems, big economic problems, demographic problems, and these won't go away. And they're not being helped by its current row with the United States. So I don't see a world in which China takes over from the United States. It's more fragmented sort of world. I think Europe has been more coherent than many would have expected, but it lacks economic dynamism. The so-called global South isn't as coherent as is often assumed. A lot of divisions within it. So I think the problem is not that there's a shift in the balance of power from the United States to China, let alone to Russia, but you're losing the dominance of the United States. It isn't putting the energy and interest and commitment into maintaining a global role for itself, but that doesn't mean anybody else can take its place. So I think it's a diffusion of power, and that makes it harder to get anything done. Essentially, this is why international institutions are weaker, multilateral organizations are weaker, and so on. I think that's the main consequence and why it's a difficult time.
Professor, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us today, that you find time to speak with us. Thank you.
It's always very good to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good luck.
Bye.